Today I'm going to give you 5 undeniable reasons why you must believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's coming up next.
5 undeniable reasons I must believe in the resurrection? As some might say, all right, let's see it.
Reason number 1 is because of the precautions of the Romans. Now, you must understand that the Romans started hearing rumors that the disciples were going to come and steal the body of Jesus Christ away and say that he rose from the dead. And so in order to prevent this from happening, they did 3 things. First of all, they put what's called a guard around the tomb. And a guard was nothing more than a group of 10 to 30 soldiers who were highly trained to protect this tomb and guard it with their lives. The second thing they did was they put a stone around the opening of the tomb, and this stone weighed somewhere close to 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. And so this hindered anybody who wanted to come in or get out. And then the third thing they did is actually put a Roman seal around this stone such that if anyone tampered with or broke this seal, they were punished by death. So to suggest, as some would, that the disciples broke in and stole the body of Jesus Christ and claimed that he rose from the dead would be highly unlikely, because here is a group of fishermen and tax collectors, and the Bible says shortly before Jesus was crucified that all of them were terrified and afraid and forsook Jesus and ran for their lives. And to think that this fearful group somehow got enough courage to break through a group of highly trained soldiers and steal the body of Jesus Christ is highly unlikely.
So if we accept exactly what Matthew says in every detail, and also accept everything Mark says in every detail, we should conclude that Jesus rose from the dead because his disciples didn't steal the body. Oh. Anybody see a problem?
The second reason is because of the faith of the disciples. We have to consider once again that right before Jesus was crucified, this group of disciples were cowards. But as soon as he rose from the dead, they all of a sudden turned into fearless preachers who were ready and willing to be beaten, burned, beheaded, sawed into 2, stoned, crucified, and even being willing to risk their very lives. So the question we have to ask is, why would this group of people be willing to risk their very lives for something they knew deep in their hearts was nothing more than a lie?
Citation needed. This is an overblown and exaggerated talking point, something that apologist Sean McDowell even points out in some of his work. But even his more modest proposals are still too optimistic. As Christian scholar Dale Allison summarizes, quote, "We in truth know next to nothing about most of these characters, who are little more than names. Even were one recklessly to imagine that Acts gives us nothing save unembellished history, the 12 disappear after Acts 6. So we know no more about most of their post-Easter lives than we know about their deaths." Unquote.
The third reason is because of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances. Perhaps one of the most convincing proofs is the fact that the Bible says that after his suffering, he gave many convincing proof that he was alive, and he appeared to them over a period of 40 days.
So if we trust Acts, we should believe that Jesus appeared to a bunch of people over 40 days. Not to beat a dead horse, but this is getting kind of ridiculous. If you're watching this and want to see an over 3-hour discussion on why prominent attempts to defend New Testament reliability fail, then see the link in the description.
The Apostle Paul goes on to say that at one time, Jesus appeared to over 500 people at one time, so much so that when he was writing this letter, he essentially told his readers, hey, if you don't believe me, you don't have to take my word for it. Go and speak to the people who saw them for themselves, because most of them are still alive today. So to say that Jesus really didn't rise from the dead would suggest that all of these hundreds of people were either crazy or hallucinating, which is highly unlikely.
So one guy said 500 people saw something. We do not have 500 pieces of testimony. We have one piece of testimony about a large group. It's also not clear that the reason he mentions the 500 is the reason that Allen says it is.
I have to say this about the 500 because often apologists make the point that the appearance to the 500 in that list, the significance of that, because Paul says, some of them are still alive. And apologists make that a point where Paul is saying, in effect, they're alive, so you can go and find them and
Yep.
interview them and confirm this. Like he's kind of like he's a scholar who's citing his sources, or
my
something
bluff,
like
that
that,
kind of
and
thing.
saying like, yeah, go check it out for yourself. And that's almost certainly not what he's thinking or why he's saying they're still alive. think the reason why he's saying some of whom are still alive is for the same reason that Ben was just talking about with 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, where Paul is addressing an anxiety about the delay of the parousia. He's addressing this belief that we see throughout the New Testament that Jesus is supposed to return in that generation. And so the point of him saying some of whom are still alive is in order to say, see, some of those who were standing there still have not yet tasted death. So we know that the promise is still just around the corner, and it hasn't been proven wrong.
Reason number 4 is that secular history confirms it. Now, it would be one thing if the Bible was the only book that recorded the miracle of the resurrection, but other secular history books record the same thing. First of all, it's recorded by a man named Josephus, who was a Jewish, non-Christian historian. Second of all, it was recorded by a man named Thomas Arnold, who wrote the history of Rome. What makes these testimonies even stronger is that they were written by non-Christians who were simply seeking to be credible and trustworthy historians, which means they had to report the truth whether they liked it or not.
First, Josephus. What do we have and what does it mean? Apologist Mike Licona explains why some Christians should calm down about this.
Josephus has a text about Jesus here that goes a little more in depth about him. And let me read you this text. It says, "At this time there appeared Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one should call him a man. For he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of people who received the truth with pleasure, and he gained a following both among many Jews and among many of Greek origin. He was the Messiah. And when Pilate, because of an accusation made by the leading men among us, condemned him to the cross, those who had loved him previously did not cease to do so. For he appeared to them on the third day, living again, just as the divine prophets had spoken of these and countless other wondrous things about him. And up until this very day, the tribe of Christians named after him has not died out." Now, that's the text of Josephus that we have today, but unfortunately, the earliest manuscript we have is centuries later, but we do have Eusebius with this text in the 4th century. The problem is Origen says that Josephus was not a Christian, and Josephus makes in this text many statements. He was the Messiah. He rose from the dead. Scripture said many wondrous things about him. These aren't the kind of things that would be said by a non-believing Jew. So most Josephus scholars think that a Christian has, sometime in the 2nd or 3rd century, doctored up this text. It's probably true. They got in, they doctored it up, made it sound better than it actually did.
And Thomas Arnold died in 1842. It's not like he had any more access to whether Jesus rose from the dead than I do. So kind of ridiculous to mention.
More recently, people like Frank Morrison, Lee Strobel, and Josh McDowell, all professed atheists, sought out to disprove the reality of the resurrection, thus proving that Christianity was nothing more than a false religion based on a myth. But as they dug into it and researched it more and more, they found that it was the undeniable truth, and eventually all of them converted.
So some atheists became Christians and then wrote about it. Setting aside the suspicious details surrounding things like Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, so what? There are Christians who became atheists and wrote about it. Or, in this case, talk about it.
And reason number 5 was that the missing body of Jesus Christ was never found. If Jesus never rose from the dead, then that means that his body would have still been in the grave, which means that all the Romans needed to do was simply reproduce the body of Jesus Christ, and then they would have settled the lie that Jesus rose from the dead, thus destroying Christianity forever. But the very fact that they could not reproduce the body is proof in and of itself that this miraculous event did occur in history.
Or, get this. Maybe his body was thrown into a mass grave, the most common thing that happened in a situation like this. Or the body was stolen by grave robbers, both of which are more plausible than a resurrection. Tap this video next to me and I'll explain.